To begin with, I live in Los Angeles, California, in the Valley. My house is a very unsettling place. Ever since I can remember, there have been unusual going-ons and oddities. The history of the house is this. The house was built in the late 50s in the Hollywood Hills, somewhere or other. I'm not quite sure. But it was eventually moved for some reason to the Valley in the early 60s, at which point my grandfather bought the house at an amazingly reasonable price for such a then luxurious and beautiful house. My family moved in, and they've lived there since. Now begins the second part of my story. When my grandfather was nearing the end of his life, he began to see things, namely my grandmother, whom he had divorced decades earlier and who had died about 3 years earlier, and a small girl who he would become agitated at the sight of and wave away, saying things like "get away, you're gone," and the like. It was very unsettling, as I said. He, however, was not alone in his unusual experience in the house, as well as my aunt and father, who've also experienced oddities here as well. And nearly all of my friends who have stayed the night, and most significantly, me. My aunt has heard voices here when she was younger, and has seen a man out of the corner of her eye, standing at the corner of her bed, watching her. She also said that this caused her to have difficulty in breathing on occasion. My father is another story altogether, but I'm unsure as to his reliability, as he is quite frankly bipolar and schizophrenic. But several years ago, after my grandmother died in '64, he went quite insane and said that a thing in his room told him to hurt himself. I would otherwise discount this as part of his psychosis or mania, but after that happened, I came into the possession of the house as part of my inheritance from my grandfather, and when I first moved in, as there was hardly any furniture and I was staying there, I had to stay at his old room at the end of the hallway. There are no windows, and the only illumination is from a wall torch here, precisely in the middle of the hall, which will play in later oddities. When I lay down in there with my dog to rest a little bit on the mattress, which had previously been his, I felt decidedly unpleasant, as if I were being watched, but was suddenly so tired that I immediately fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, and my dog was huddled in the corner, whimpering and watching the ceiling in the diagonally opposite corner of the room, and seemed very frightened. The unpleasant feeling of being watched had greatly increased, and I left the room as hastily as I possibly could. When I had first moved in, about a week after the oddness with my dog, and before I could move over my bed from my previous residence, I'd moved over my father's bed from his old corner room and begun to sleep upon it. Things were fine for about a month or so, until one night, I awoke to see the silhouette of a tallish man standing in the doorway to my bathroom. There is a bathroom attached to my bedroom, and a door leading out from the bathroom into the entrance hall by the front door. The man was standing with his arms slightly bowed and head lowered with shoulders tense, and seemed angry for some reason, very angry. The man pointed at me, and I blinked, and he disappeared. What was even more disturbing about it was that the man appeared to be composed entirely of shadow, as if the brightest light possible were shining behind him, while the lighting behind him was just as it always is, as at that time, I usually left the entrance hall light on for anyone coming home late, and the light in my bathroom was on, which was directly flush with the man. Even more disturbing was that after I blinked, the man was gone, and when I looked to investigate, the door was once more closed, but the door was unlocked, which it never was, and the light in the bathroom was still on, which it also never was. I made a thorough search of my room, and it was completely sealed, and there was no possible way for what happened to have happened. About a day or two later, and this is the weirdest, most terrifying part, and the most horrific, I was laying in bed, the one my father had shot himself on after my grandmother had died, although he did not die of it. Hands began to form out of the mattress and massage my body. At first I thought it was a dream, as it was so absurd, but did not feel bad and was actually soothing, until the hands began to gouge and claw at me, trying to pull me into the bed, at which point I began to shriek and jumped out and off of the bed and watched as the hands very silently melted, almost back into the mattress. My body hurt very much, and I went to observe myself in the full-length mirror, which my grandfather had hung upon the door between my room and my bathroom, which had been his. He was a short man though, so I don't believe the Shadow Man had anything to do with it. And I noticed that my entire body, from ankles to just below my neck, was covered in glass, as if I'd been scratched all over as well, and many were bleeding, although not profusely. I ran out of the room and did not sleep the rest of the evening, and in the morning removed both bed and frame and put them in the trash and on the curb. After this, I began to have nightmares in which a massive presence chased me through the rooms of places in which I'd previously lived, or I would be in a normalish dream. I'm presuming that they were normal because I had never had a real dream, only nightmares, and then I would sense something approaching, even through the walls of the buildings in the dreams, and then it would appear and rush at me and attack by grabbing me by the neck and throttling me, and though it did not speak or even make sound or have form, I could see it as if it did, and it had the form of a large human-like thing. It could taunt me as if I could hear its thoughts. It strangled me and lifted my feet off of the ground and prevented me from calling out or even making sound, and I would struggle until I finally awoke. Many of the times I would awaken to find large handprints upon my neck, larger even than my hands. The worst of the strangulation dreams was one set in my back hallway. In the dream, I was walking about the house and heard something frying in the kitchen like eggs, and when I went in there, eggs were on the stove, and I felt such an inexplicable horror. After I went into the kitchen, I heard my dog whimpering in distress and ran to the sound and found her in the back hallway, and she was being held up by the throat and throttled as I had been before. I ran over shouting at the shadow thing and threw myself at it to force it to release my dog, and she was thrown back against the corner of the side hall, which leads to the other bathroom of the master bedroom, and laid unconscious, at which it began to throttle me until I managed to shout out God and was dropped, and awoke immediately to find my neck was severely sore and with bruising all over it. When I went to check on my dog, she was whimpering, and my mother could not figure out why she had suddenly began to whimper in the middle of the night. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it was kind of wild, but there are definitely shadow presences in this home, and they are really torturous. I hope nobody ever gets to experience what I experienced, but hey, it makes for a great story.
Being a kid from a large single-parent family, we moved around a lot. One of these homes was on 1864 Robinson. We were poor. My mom tried hard to give us the things we needed, but she had no help. My two younger brothers and I used to share a room and a bed together. We used to sleep upstairs in a large room, just opposite the bathroom on the south side of the house. It had a large window, with no curtains or coverings, so the streetlights used to shine through at night. At the end of the room was a closet that had no door. We rarely used it. One night, I was awakened by a large blue light coming from outside the room. I thought it was from the bathroom, but it was an intense blue and seemed to grow brighter and brighter. The door to our room was partly open, and all of a sudden, a young boy was standing in the doorway. He stood there, looking at me. I was frozen with fear. I tried to yell, but nothing came out. He was bathed in a blue light that, to this day, I have yet to experience again. He floated above the floor. He moved slowly towards me, gliding on air. He then floated along the wall, away from us to the closet. He stopped, turned, and floated in, the light disappearing. I couldn't move. I tried and tried. Finally, I slid off the bed and crawled to the stairs. I tried to walk down, but my legs gave way and I fell. My mom awoke and rushed to see what happened. She held me as I told her. She put me in her room and went and got my brothers. No one ever went in that room again. I used to go by there from time to time, until one day I went, and there now was a new home built there. Makes me wonder if anything strange ever happens to them. I have 3 stories to share. The first is an experience I had 20 years ago. My aunt, who lived with us, passed away. When she was alive, she would go out and get a snack around the same time every night. After her funeral, every night at about the same time, the refrigerator door would open and close. This went on for a couple of weeks, then stopped. Every so often, I still get a whiff of her perfume, as if she just walked past me. The second was experienced by both me and my daughter. She was very close to her grandfather her entire life. He passed away in 2000, shortly before the birth of her first child. Shortly after his passing, my daughter said in the middle of the night she would feel someone sit on the corner of her bed. When she would turn to look, no one was there. This was something her grandfather had done when she was little. After the baby was born, my daughter started noticing other strange things. The baby would turn her head, as if watching someone walking across the room, but no one was there. One night, she was holding the baby, and the baby was staring at what, to my daughter, was a blank wall and laughing. My daughter looked at the baby, and there was a reflection of the figure of a man, as if he were standing exactly where the baby was looking. Several times when I was babysitting at my daughter's house, the baby's musical toys would turn on by themselves, with no one close to them. And the baby would stare at that wall and laugh, as if someone was standing there. My daughter doesn't live in the house any longer, and the strange things seem to have stopped. The third is the strangest of all. My son and some of his friends went to an abandoned house that is supposedly haunted. The story is that a man killed his entire family in the house and then himself. There are bullet holes in the walls in the upstairs to support the story. Finding nothing of interest upstairs or on the main floor, they decided to investigate the basement. They found a partial wall at the end of the basement. They noticed a terrible odor coming from that area of the room. They looked over the top of the wall and found nothing but some old boots and a shovel. When they went back to go upstairs to the main floor, there was wet blood on the stairs. It had not been there on the way down. They nosed around on the main floor again and found some money tucked in a broken TV set. There was blood on the money too, but it was dried. Each person took a bill home with them. They all started to have extremely bad luck. Car accidents and such. They thought it might be connected to the money, so they took it back and placed it where they found it. The bad luck went away. They checked the basement again, but nothing was there. Others say you can drive past the house and see lights on in the windows, even though there are no working lights, and there is no power to the house. Some say they've seen the figure of a child or a lady in one of the bedroom windows. My son and his friends have not been back since, and my son refuses to even drive past the house anymore. Growing up as a minister's daughter, I was very skeptical about ghosts all my life. Then I went to a small private college in Tennessee. My first year was pretty uneventful, but the second year I moved into a new dorm. My room was a suite of 2 rooms with a bathroom in between, and my former roommate lived in the other room. The first year in the suite there was only one occurrence of what I now think was a supernatural event. Normally, the doors between the 2 suites were kept shut. But one weekend, the girls on the other side of the suite asked my roommate and I to feed their hermit crabs while they went home. They had been gone for a day when my roommate and I came by to our dorm from lunch to find every single electrical appliance running, including the microwave, radio, and hair dryers. We had left the door to the adjoining suite open, but as we assumed it was just some silly call to prove it was there, it did. We had all been in the bedroom, and after our conference, we all went into the living area together. A huge stuffed bear that had been on its usual place on the floor when I had left the room earlier was now sprawled across the couch. Of course, we were pretty scared then. The pranks became worse. Wet towels no one had used would be on the bathroom floor. Breezes coming from nowhere would move the dust ruffles on the bed. Things would be taken out of drawers and left on the floor. On homecoming weekend, I was the only one who had stayed in town. I was in the suite alone, taking a shower, when I heard someone unlock and open the door to the living area and walk in. I heard high-heel shoes walk across the floor, through the bathroom, and through the other room and walk out the bedroom door. I thought at first that it was one of my roommates who decided to come home to homecoming after all, and I called out, "Hello?" But no one answered. The only other experience I have had is at the house in Vermont where Joe Walsh used to live. My husband's uncle is the caretaker there, and shortly after I met my husband, he took me up there to look at the house. I had not been told of any ghost stories connected to the house at this point. As we walked around the house, I became increasingly agitated. By the time we were upstairs, I was having trouble breathing. As we started toward the ballroom, I knew I had to get out fast. I was terrified and sensed just an overpowering feeling of evil there. I raced out, and I refused to even look at the house anymore. Later that day, my husband's uncle told me about all the different stories and encounters people have reported about the house. A man had hung himself in the very room that I had trouble breathing in. And at night, the uncle heard sound of people and objects moving frequently. I am now a true believer in ghosts, but I am also terrified of them, and I hope these are all the experiences that I will ever have.
This is a true story that took place at Yokosuka, Japan. There's an American naval base there. When I first arrived in the spring of '81, there was a white building on the corner of the property that the naval hospital is located. Shortly after my arrival, bulldozers demolished the building to make way for 2 high-rise apartment buildings that would house American servicemen and their families. My family and I would be housed in one of these buildings after its construction. The buildings were named Cuban and Juban Towers, the Japanese words for 9 and 10. There were already 8 of these towers on base. Immediately after construction was completed, my wife was notified that she was to move into an apartment in Cuban Towers. I was out at sea. She complied, and it wasn't long before she started noticing strange occurrences in the apartment. Minor things, like the lights being on, and she was sure she had turned them off. Months later, I returned home and was pleased that we had moved into such better housing on base. But I was met with strange stories from my 3-year-old son. He told me of a Marine sentry who visited him each night in his room. I assured him that he was dreaming. My first night home, I tucked him into bed and turned off all the lights in the house. At 3 a.m., I was awakened by a presence at my side of the bed. It was my son, and all the lights were on in the apartment. I asked him what was going on, and he said that the Marine sentry was in his room and wanted the lights on. I, of course, checked out his story to make sure the house was safe. No one else was in the house beside my family and I. I tucked my son back into bed and turned off the lights. The next morning, I asked my son to describe the man who kept visiting him in his room. That 3-year-old boy floored me when he described the infantry marine in full combat gear. This problem occurred for several weeks. One time, a buddy of mine suggested that I turn the lights out of the breaker box, which was out of my son's reach, and my son did not know where the box was. So I did. At 3 a.m., I awoke to the same scenario as always. So then my buddy agreed to spend the night in my son's room with him. At 3 a.m., I awoke to an awful ruckus in my son's room. My son ran into my room to tell me that the mister was fighting with the Marine sentry. When I arrived in my son's room, my buddy was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room. The bedroom looked as if a brawl had just occurred. My buddy told me that he woke up and seen a Marine standing over him. He was wearing face paint to camouflage his appearance and was in full combat gear. The Marine face looked as if he were in the jungle and he had stumbled onto an enemy camp. It was clear that the Marine was on a mission, but no Marine was there. From that night on, no one in the house seen the Marine again, but either he or one of his friends was still in the apartment, as we still experienced strange occurrences. We could be sitting at the dining room table eating, and all of a sudden, the TV would come on and go to full audio, or the washing machine lid would open and close, and the washing machine would start up by itself. We put up with it, as it seemed more amusing than annoying. We were never awakened in the middle of the night again, though. Finally, during our last week in the apartment, it was obvious that the ghost wanted us to stay. Things began to disappear. In 1977, I was 8 years old and lived with my parents and my younger brother in a big house in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. There, I had an experience that I remember like it was yesterday. One night, I was awoke feeling cold. I sat up in my bed to reach for an extra blanket that was folded at the foot of my bed. When I did so, I saw a ghost standing several feet from the foot of my bed. The figure I saw looked like that blue dot you see in your vision after looking into a flash from a camera, but it had the distinct shape of a person. After looking at this form for some time, I jumped from my bed and ran down the hall into the bathroom, turning on the lights and shutting the door. Eventually, I got the courage to look down the hall and turned on all the lights. The blue man had disappeared, and I eventually went back to sleep with all the lights on. I told my mom, and only my mom, as I did not think anyone would believe me. The strangest thing about this is that a week or so later, my mom was talking to the neighbor, who told my mom her son had told her almost the exact same story, describing the ghost in the same way. I never discussed my sighting with the neighbor kid or anyone other than my own mother for years. My mother still lives in the same house, and has had several strange experiences since then, but no more sightings of the blue man. Just wanted to share this experience my mother had while she was in Mercy General Hospital in Sacramento, California, recovering from a hysterectomy. One night Mom woke up, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw a dark mass floating in the hallway. It floated between her door and the doorway across the hall, where a very sick woman was a patient. It never entered the rooms, it just hovered there. When she tried to look straight at it, it disappeared. For 3 nights, she saw this black mass floating in the hallway. Then, on the 4th day, Mom heard code blue on the intercom, and heard a loud commotion in the hallway as doctors and nurses hurried into the room across the hall, pulling their equipment behind them. The woman in that room died. Mom didn't see the dark mass that night, or any night after that, during the remainder of her stay. My name is Minsu, and I would like to share my supernatural experiences with you, because no one is willing to believe or accept my encounters. It all started about 3 days ago, at about 2 in the morning. I woke up to hear some very loud and disturbing footsteps. This probably wouldn't have scared me so much, except that the footsteps came from the first roof of my house. I didn't know what to do, so I just lied there scared. But 10 seconds later, whatever made the footsteps on the roof was breathing loudly at my window. At this point, I jumped out of my bed and ran into my mother's room. I looked out her window and saw absolutely nothing. The next day I told my mother what I had heard, and of course, she just snickered and thought nothing of it. Next night, I was determined to stay up and see what was going on. At 3:30 in the morning this time, I was startled by a loud thump in front of my window and quickly shot out of bed to see what it was. Again, I see nothing. At this point, I was scared and puzzled as to what this was. I climbed back into bed and continued to listen. The thumping went on, but as it did, I began to hear something different, something in the background of all the noise. It was laughter, not normal funny laughter. It was hysterical, mad in a way. The thumping continued, and the laughter faded, and I began to slowly doze off. When I awoke this time, I immediately told my sister what I heard. Unfortunately, she was the only one who believed me. Although this thumping and laughter was very frightening, it may have had some connections to the encounter I experienced just a few weeks ago. I was in my sister's room, looking for a book I had lost. Under the bed, I was sure. When all of a sudden, I saw a woman dressed in blue standing over me. I let out a scream and ran downstairs to tell my mom. We went back upstairs to check things out. Nothing was there, but this time, my mom was considerably worried. She thought it maybe have been a burglar and frantically checked under the bed and in the closet, but found nothing. These two experiences may be connected, but for now, they will remain a mystery. I was raised in Missouri City, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. If you head south of Murphy Road, past Cartwright Road, on the left, you will come to El Dorado Drive. Travel down El Dorado until you cross the bridge and turn right at the first street. Drive down the street until you come to Hampton. There, you will see a very large fence covered in overgrowth. Through the fence, you can see a large home that backs itself to the golf course. This home is known by all who live in its vicinity as the Hampton House or the Cartwright House. The story begins about 40 years ago. Mr. Cartwright and his wife lived in the house and owned all of the property which Quail Valley is built upon today. Cartwright Road was actually named after him. All was well until Mrs. Cartwright came down with a terminal illness of some sort. When Mr. Cartwright was no longer able to give his wife the care she demanded, he hired a live-in nurse. As his wife's condition worsened, Mr. Cartwright began fraternizing with the nurse. One day, when Mrs. Cartwright's calls went unanswered, she made her way into her wheelchair and into the living room, catching her husband and the nurse in a moment of passion. Miss Cartwright died the next day. Mr. Cartwright and the nurse soon after moved away together and were married. He left all the furniture and some of his possessions in the house when he left. After his death, the property was left to his son, which would not live at the house, but hired security guards to keep looters out. My father was a Fort Bend County Sheriff deputy for many years and has had friends work security at the house in the evening. He said that the guards were paid very well and were given a large cooler of food to take with them into the house. There's never been a security guard that has stayed in the house for more than 3 hours. They've reported the elevator going up and down on its own, sounds of a woman crying, an invisible wheelchair that travels up and down the hallway, leaving tracks in the carpet, and even books flying off the shelves at them. One of my father's good friends is from Ireland, and he says he had encounters with ghosts before and is unafraid. He worked in the house and left after 2 hours. He said he has never seen anything like it. Well, the security guards have since stopped in the past 10 years. The house has never been lived in since the Cartwrights. I've always wanted to sneak into it some Halloween night and see for myself. But since it would be breaking and entering, and hence illegal, I will not. I have never seen anything about the house listed anywhere, yet everyone in the area seems to know about it. I have several stories that I could tell, and I'll probably post another as time goes on, but this is the most recent. In March 1998, my stepdaughter was pregnant with her first child, and at the same time, her father-in-law was in the last stages of cancer and dying. Her husband spent about 3 weeks at a Central Georgia hospital by his father's bedside. He died on March 23rd and was buried on March 25th. She had the baby on March 26th. It was a boy, and it was named after his deceased grandfather. They kept a picture of the man that had died on the refrigerator and had told their son that this was Granddaddy Kenneth. When the child was about 2.5 and talking, there were several times when they heard him talking to someone when no one was in the room with him. Each time, they would ask him who he was talking to, and he would respond with, "Granddaddy Kenneth." When they asked him who that was, he would say, "That man on the refrigerator." When they asked him what they had talked about, his answers were always about things that the child would have no way of knowing had someone not told him of them, and his parents never had. It has been a couple of months now since he's had conversations with his grandfather that they know of. I was stationed at Fort Air Base between 1999 and early 2003. During my time, I'd heard many stories and had been witness to something I can't explain. Most of the incidents I heard concerning the old Fort Cook section of the base, including the base lodging office where I worked at, in Quarters 13, which was on General's Row and was used as distinguished visitors' quarters. I encountered something I can't explain at the lodging office one night. Me and the sergeant I was working with that night heard someone typing and moving around in the back offices, which were locked about 6 hours earlier. We both went in there, and there was no one there. Both doors were still locked. Neither of us could explain it, and both of us had heard it. Another night, we heard the same thing and heard a radio turn on. We both ran back there, and once again, nothing. We even looked at the clock that had turned on by itself, thinking maybe the alarm was timed to go off at that time. But the alarm was turned off, and it was not even set up when we pressed the button. And it still flashed at 12 a.m., and it was about 2:30 in the morning, which didn't make sense. Quarters 13, which was our responsibility, since it was the DV suite, was even more troublesome. The people who stayed there were usually colonels, and above, transiting through the base, very high-ranking people. People you normally wouldn't expect to hear anything about weird noises. One stands out quite a bit in my mind. A colonel kept calling the front desk, complaining of people walking around in the attic and making a lot of noise. I went over there to check it out, which is about a 5-minute walk from the lodging office. The colonel was waiting on the porch, and we both went up to the attic to check it out. The door was locked, and after unlocking it, we both went inside. No one was in there, just some boxes. I got a weird feeling while we were up there that someone was watching me, but there was no one in there. I explained to the colonel that maybe it was a rat or something in a box or something that made those noises. He shrugged and went back to bed, and I'm sure he was as unconvinced as I was. I went back to the lodging office, and talking to my coworker, she told me about the building and the stories about it. Apparently, whatever was in there had manifested itself to the housekeeping staff, as several of them refused to go in the attic. They would never say why, but they refused to go up there. And one of the rooms is also supposedly haunted. I heard this in the early part of 2000, and in late 2002, a 1-star colonel died of a heart attack in that same room. I don't know whether to believe what I heard or not, but I heard from several people that were in the room that he had died with his eyes open and a horrified look on his face. I've remained skeptical of hearing this. I figure even if this was true, it may have just been from the shock and realization he was dying. But then again, who knows? Other buildings on the base that I've heard that were haunted were the base gym and the old Martin Bomber building on the base, where B-29s were built during the Second World Conflict. I worked at the gym for about 2 years while at OFET, and I saw something odd one day with my supervisor when we were doing our final checks of the building. The gym is an old aircraft hangar and is nearly a quarter of a mile long. We rode around in a golf cart for our checks. This is a 1/4 mile track inside the gym, and all the state flags hang from the ceiling around the track. While we were doing our checks, The flags began moving in front of us, like someone had been running by and jumped and hit it. Except the flags hang nearly 40 feet up in the air, and there was no wind inside. Neither one of us could explain this, but I do know that someone had died of a heart attack while jogging a couple of years earlier. Could it have been him out for a run? I'm curious if you have heard any other stories about a Foot Air Base. I'm working on some research on the base, and I'm wondering if anyone else has experienced something here. I felt compelled to send in a few of my strange experiences that I had at my grandparents' former house. One evening, I was talking on the phone to a friend in the master bedroom. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and the room was pitch black, as I was going to get some sleep directly. As I chatted to my friend, suddenly, I saw what is best described as a black cloud about the shape, size, and position of where a person's head should be. It bobbed as if someone were walking by the foot of the bed for about 3 seconds, and then it was gone. I was doing some homework at the kitchen table one evening when out of the corner of my eye, I again saw a black flash that looked to be the size of a small dog run across the hallway floor. When I commented on this, my grandfather, who was living in the room at the time, claimed to experience the same thing all the time. My grandparents' house is set up so that you walk in the front door and all the rooms are connected by a hallway that at one end leads to the kitchen and the dining room, living room, master bedroom, staircase to the second floor, bathroom, and back to the door. It was summertime, and my mother and I were arguing. I was standing at the foot of the stairs and looking at her in the living room. I was making a fuss, saying that I wanted to sleep upstairs, which I had only recently conquered my fear of, and she was telling me that it was too hot up there to do so. Mid-sentence, I glanced up the staircase, and what I saw horrified me. Staring back down at me from the top of the steps was this hazy, cloud-like figure of a human. I believe it was a male. It was only the second time I was ever truly afraid. I was cleaning my room on the second floor one day, and it was very hot, being that it was summer and heat rises, so I opened one of the old weighted windows. It was not an easy task due to old paint, which had practically glued itself shut, and it only budged after I pried it with a screwdriver. I tried to pull it down to see if I needed to prop it, and it wouldn't move, so I carried on with my cleaning. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the window shut with a loud bang behind me. Again, I opened the window, only this time I propped it open with a paint stirrer. After about 2 minutes, the window again banged shut behind me, this time so hard that the glass broke. The paint stirrer was at least 8 feet across the room. I said, "You win," and ran downstairs. I was a staff assistant in my sophomore year at St. Michael's. What this meant was basically, I watched the doors coming into one of the dorms to make sure that the only people coming in were the residents. I sat at a desk from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. a couple of nights a week. One night, I was making the rounds from floor to floor to make sure all was relatively quiet. I got to the top floor of the building, and that is, of course, when the proverbial strange things started to happen. I began walking down the hall, and I heard the wind howling through the recycling room on the floor. It had been a quiet night weather-wise, so this was a little odd. I passed it off as some random New England weather patterns and continued to walk on. When I stepped in front of the first resident's door, it started to rattle like someone was going to come out. I stopped and waited, but the door just kept rattling, so I moved on. Then, the next door on the other side of the hall started to rattle as I passed in front of it, And then another door started to rattle also. Now there were 3 doors all rattling away, and it only started when I walked in front of them. They hadn't done this earlier in the evening, and I was wide awake, so it wasn't my imagination. What really startled me was all of a sudden, in the midst of all this door action, I had a feeling that someone was right behind me. I turned around me, and from the distance, I could have sworn I saw the fading image of a priest in all black slowly fade, but the doors kept on shaking, and the wind was screaming. So I ran the rest of the way down the hall and back downstairs to my desk. A check of the outside revealed that the weather was perfectly calm. I believe this is the oldest dorm on campus, so who knows what otherworldly beings reside there. The other thing that happened to me while I was there was sort of a strange religious experience, and I'm probably one of the last people something like this would happen to. I was driving home from my then boyfriend's, now husband's house, and heading back to my dorm at St. Mike's. I was at a stoplight, alone in the car, when I heard this deep, low, and gravelly male voice tell me that the second coming was going to happen soon. The voice filled me with dread and danger. It sounded a lot like a voice that had been altered to sound lower, like when documentaries try to disguise voices of the people they interview. The light turned green, and I drove off. I then looked into the mirror without thinking, and I could have sworn I saw the same priest from the hall, sitting in the back seat of the car. I stopped the car immediately, looked back, and nobody was there. I felt like I was going crazy, because I knew I saw someone in the back seat of my car. About 2 minutes later, I started to think about what just happened, and got very scared. I talked to one of the priests at school the next day, and he felt this was a normal experience within the realm of St. Michael's. Partially because it was getting near Christmas time, and partially because he felt the campus was a center for both good and evil, the good being the chapel on campus, and the bad being the portal that was never shot in the boys' dormitory. He confirmed the story about the pentagram and my location discretion without me bringing it up. I've heard this godly voice once or twice since the original incident, but not to the degree that I heard that night. I once heard of an experience my boyfriend had in that same chapel. He told me that on one occasion he was alone. He walked into the chapel, and under the huge statue, he saw 2 figures in cloaks praying silently under the statue. He's a complete skeptic when it comes to hauntings, and he insisted that there was nobody there at the time. When I was 7 years old, my parents, my sister, and I lived in a home that was 1-story house that sat way back from the street. My aunt used to babysit us when my parents were away at work. Anytime I got into trouble, my aunt would make me go into a little bedroom in the back of our house, and she would make me stay in there for hours at a time. I never knew why, but I was deathly afraid of that room, and the whole time I was in there, I would hide under the blankets too afraid to move until she came to let me out. One day, while I was playing in the yard, I found out why I was so afraid of that room. While I was outside playing with my toys, I suddenly got the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around me, but I didn't see anybody. I went back to playing, but I just couldn't shake that watched feeling. I turned to look at the house to see if maybe my aunt or sister was around, and I saw a woman in the bathroom window watching me. I know it wasn't my aunt or sister, because they both have very dark hair, and the woman in the window had very light-colored hair. I don't know what to do. I was afraid to move. I stayed outside for the rest of the afternoon, because I didn't want to go into the house. When my mom came home that day, I finally went inside. I didn't say anything to my mom or anyone about what I had seen. I was worried that they wouldn't believe me, so I kept quiet. My sister and I shared a bedroom, and that night, I woke up to the sounds of cupboards opening and closing, like someone was looking for something, and I heard glasses being moved around and the water being turned off and on. Well, being a little kid, I figured I was just imagining it, and as I lay there listening to this, I looked over at my sister, who was sleeping through this whole thing. The next morning, I asked my mom if she was up last night getting a drink, and she said no, but she looked at me kind of funny. That night, my mom had some friends over, and she sent my sister and I to bed early. My sister fell right to sleep, but I just kept thinking about what I saw in the window and what I had heard the night before. My mom and her friends started talking about a lady who had hung herself in the back bedroom of our house. I could not believe what I was hearing. My mom then went on to tell her friends that she hears noises in the kitchen at night. The next day, as I was playing in the yard, I saw the woman in the bathroom window again. I started to cry, and my aunt got mad at me, so she tried to lock me in the back room again. I was kicking and screaming that I did not want to go back in there, but she wouldn't listen to me. As I sat on the bed, under the covers, I heard the door swing open. I thought it was my aunt to come let me out, so I uncovered my head, but nobody was there. I then started to hear a squeaking noise, kinda like something heavy hanging from a window bar. It sounded like it was coming from the closet. The closet was a really big walk-in one. There was no way I was going to look in there. I just sat on the bed, listening to this noise, until my aunt came to get me. I later found out that the lady hung herself in the closet of that back room. I'm just wondering if anyone knows why she did this, and when it took place. Well, that's my story, and believe me, it is all completely true. I'm an identical twin, and often because of this, most people ask us if we share experiences. You know, they say, like on television. My answer is always the same. Sometimes. It's true that twins, on occasion, may share certain emotions, even though they may be miles apart. This is what my brother and I have known for years. But everything changed when my brother and his wife and 2 children moved into my late grandfather's home in Norristown, Pennsylvania. The history of the house is nothing spectacular. The only event of any importance occurred when my grandfather, who had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 1987, decided to spend his final days at home before the cancer took him. He died in a hospital bed, which had been set up in the living room of his house later that year, and from that point forward, various members have lived in the house without any strange occurrences or bump in the night, until my brother Peter and his family moved in. The first week in their new home, my brother was excited as ever about living in such a large home compared to the meager apartment he and his family had been sharing for the past 2 years. Given the history of the house, i.e., my grandfather dying there, didn't bother him one bit, since he was the last person who believed in such tales. Then, about 2 months after moving in, he decided to clean out the basement to make room for his music equipment. He is a part-time musician, and a new washer and dryer my father had bought them as a Christmas present. While digging through the accumulated junk of a half a century, he happened upon a small Bible. Inside the front cover was an inscription denoting the Bible as a gift to my grandfather from my great-grandmother in 1906. He took it upstairs and laid it out on one of the coffee tables so that other family members visiting could see it when they visited. Remember that I had yet to hear of this find, since it only had occurred that day, but that night I had one of the most terrifying nightmares I could ever remember. I dreamt I was standing on the landing, overlooking the living room of my brother's house in Norristown, Pennsylvania, but something was wrong. Having visited the house many times in the past, I vividly remember the layout of how it used to look when I was a child, but in my dream, I remember seeing an end table, which was never there before, on which a book was placed. I was drawn to it for some reason. I slowly descended the stairs, even now, recalling how hollow my footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor as I made my way towards the table. As I got there, I looked down and saw that it was, surprise, a small Bible. Upon opening it, I saw there was an inscription made out to my brother from our father. This is where things got really spooky. I remember hearing my brother's voice behind me say, "This is mine, which Dad gave me. Please give it back." I was too terrified to look around, because even though it sounded like my brother, there was something otherworldly about the whole thing. I finally succumbed to curiosity and turned around. This was, of course, when I woke up screaming something. I don't remember what. I startled my wife, who was then yelling at me to keep it down. The neighbors will think we're fighting or something. Later that morning, I spoke to Peter to tell him the strange dream I had, and that's when he told me about what he had found and who it really belonged to. I was startled beyond words. I told him I would be down in an hour. I live in Parksea, Pennsylvania, approximately an hour north of Norristown, to see the book. "Too late," he said. "Why?" I asked. "It's gone," he replied. The conversation went on from there about how he had placed it on the end table, an end table that he just picked up at a yard sale that day, but when he woke up, it was gone. I asked if his wife had taken it, but he said that it was impossible. They had flown back to Texas 2 days earlier to visit her folks and took the kids with her for the short vacation. After going around and around about what could have happened to it, as well as the strange dream I had and what the voice had said to me, in the end, we just didn't know what to say. I guess it was one of those things that will never really be explained. 2 weeks later, his wife and 2 children arrived back home and were in the process of unpacking when she went down to the basement to see how the cleanup had gone. That's when she asked him about the small Bible. "What Bible?" he asked his wife. "Oh, the one in the basement near the keyboard you put there." Looking confused, I'm sure, my brother ran down to the basement, and sure enough, there it was on the door, right where he had originally found it. Picking it up, he read the inside cover again, only this time, there was no inscription at all. Did he imagine the writing to begin with? Did my weird dream that night have anything to do with it disappearing again? I don't know. Neither does Peter, but there's definitely activity in that basement, because what I saw next in the basement a few days later almost explains some things, although it was incredibly scary. I had another bizarre dream. I ended up going back to the basement to retrieve the Bible, only this time, there was a red humanoid-looking creature sitting on a chair reading a book. He had horns protruding from his head, and he looked like an ape crossed with Bigfoot. His face very human looking at the same time. Frozen in shock, I approached him. He pointed to the book, and there was an image of a car on fire. I woke up in a cold sweat and screamed. A few days later, I got a call from a guy who sounded like my grandfather. I kid you not, it sounded identical to him. All this man said to me on the phone was, "Check on your father. Something's wrong with him." I later found out that my dad had been in a car wreck. The car caught on fire. He managed to escape alive. The most shocking thing, my twin brother had the exact same dream on the same night. Same exact creature. I guess they say twins are inseparable. When I was younger, I had a terrifying experience with a ghost. I was fast asleep, and then I suddenly woke up. Something told me to wake up, and I just did. I looked at the clock, and it said somewhere around 3:28 a.m. I turned my head slightly to the left, and I saw this girl. I would say that she was in her early teens. She looked very blurry, but she had a blue hue, and it clear at the same time. She was moving in slow motion. It seemed like she was underwater, or something. She had a long nightgown, and it was blowing very slowly. She was holding a short candlestick, and her hair was long reddish brown color. She looked at me, and then I looked back at her. I was surprisingly calm. I got up to tell my mom what I had seen. The next morning, I woke up, and I asked my mom if she saw the lady, and she said, "What lady?" Could this have all been a dream? I'm not entirely sure. I've been deeply confused about this ever since. My house has always had extra company. It's been 13 years since we moved in here, and for a while, there were some really odd things happening. I was 10 years old when we moved in, and fell in love with the huge, empty attic upstairs. I would bring my toys and little sister up there to play with. She was around 8 at the time, so we had a lot of fun together. We brought our dollhouse up there and would spend hours making up stories and having fun. I would go up there and read by myself a lot because it was quieter than the rest of the house. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened while my sister and I played up there, and I felt very comfortable. In the far end of the room were little racks where clothing must have hung before. One day, I was up there alone playing when I discovered this old-fashioned looking gold purse with a painting of a deer and a medal on it, and being a lover of old things, I was psyched. I brought it to my mother, and she said it looked like a pocketbook from the 1920s that her grandmother used to have, sort of a flapper type style. We hung the pocketbook in the back of the closet to keep it out of harm's way. About a year later, my father and a friend of his transformed my attic playroom into a bedroom for both me and my sister. My father had left a quarter of the room where the pocketbook had been found alone, and put up a wall and a door separating the rest of the bedroom from that area. My sister did not like her bed being up against the wall of the back room. Then, what I felt next was unexpected and unbelievable. I was laying there with my eyes open, frozen with fear. I felt as if someone was watching me, but I was afraid to move. I'd never felt like this before. I was never afraid of the dark as a child. My sister said, "Can I please come over and sleep with you?" Now, I usually said no to this and stopped being a baby, but I wanted her to come over, pretending to be reluctant. I said, "All right, but don't hug me," even though I really wanted to be. She ran over and squeezed me, and I squeezed back, and she said, "I'm scared," and I said, "Me too." And then boom, boom, boom. 4 loud knocks right on the wall, which our heads were practically up against. I could actually feel the vibrations from the wall. Then my sister, crying, said, "What was that?" I made it up. I said, "Me." I said, "Don't worry." I was trying to tell myself that it was me when it happened again. Boom, boom, boom. We both jumped up and ran downstairs at this point, into my parents' bedroom, and my father went up to see if there was anyone hiding up there. No one was. However, my sister refused to go back up there and slept with my parents. I, however, went back up there scared, but mad that my favorite place was trying to kick me out. I felt almost betrayed and hurt, so I stayed up there for the whole night, refusing to leave, but hoping it would not try to scare me. It didn't. My sister would make attempts to sleep up there later, but would always run downstairs at some point. I couldn't blame her, since most of the time I really wanted to join her, but never would. Over the next several years, I often heard whispering and the doorknob being wiggled as if someone was trying to get in. At first, then it became a game. The doorknob would wiggle really fast, and I would say, "I'm trying to sleep," and it would stop, and then I got used to the weird noises. It's 13 years later, and in that time, I've had many friends tell me that they heard whispering or tapping on the wall, or someone breathing in their ear. To which I say, "I told you there was a ghost in my house." But it sparked my interest in the paranormal, in which I'm an avid believer because of my ghost buddy. I don't know if the purse actually belonged to the ghost, but the house was built in 1940, after the flapper times. But my mother did tell me that the old man who used to occupy the house had 2 wives who both passed on. Whether or not either of them died in this house, I don't know. The purse may have belonged to one of them. Hello, my name is Kirk. I'm about to turn 18, and I live in New York State. I apologize in advance for the length of my story, but I never get to talk to anyone about these things that happen. I'm looking for answers as to whether or not the house I live in is haunted. I don't talk to my friends about them because I always get the weirdest reactions when I mention them. You know, the kind of look someone makes when they think you're insane. Since I was a little kid, I'd always found the paranormal amusing. My mom believes in ghosts based on her own experiences, which I might say are quite frightening. I have 2 older sisters, and both have related their own personal experiences to me. So, in a way, I suppose I was influenced into finding the supernatural interesting. I live in a 2-family house that my family owns. We used to rent the bottom apartment out to people back in the late 80s to early 90s. The tenants have said that the downstairs apartment is haunted, and a psychic my mom brought over one time said that the apartment was indeed haunted. In one of the rooms downstairs, my great-grandfather passed away. The house has been in our family for a while. Also, my mom's nephew who came over from Ecuador was living with us when I was about 7 or 8. Hard to remember. He died while living here in a car accident in Lake George. Is it possible he has unfinished business because his wife and daughter live in another country? Also, my mom's boyfriend of a long time ago, this is back in Ecuador, which was probably in the 60s, died on a hiking trip. My mom loved him and always insists that he watches over her. That's just some background information, because they could all be possible haunts. The experiences I'm remembering are all recent ones. We moved from our old house in the early 90s and moved to Salem, Massachusetts. After 3 years, we moved back to our house in New York, and after that time, it's the only experiences I remember. My older sisters slept in our redone attic when they were teenagers. I was envious, because they were on a whole different floor of the house. I used to think the attic was cool. Both my sisters have had stories about the attic. My sisters moved out long ago, which gave me the advantage of choosing a room up in the attic, being older and all. I chose the room which was my oldest sister's because of its size and location in the house. It was the last room and had stairs in the room going down and leading into the second floor apartment. The first night I slept up there, a good friend of 10 years stayed the night with me. He's the only one I talked to about my experiences with. It was about 2 a.m. and we were lying awake, starting to doze off. He had his Discman with him and was playing a CD with the headphones off of his head so we could both hear the music. I was lying there when all of a sudden I heard the distinct and startling noise of a marble rolling down the stairs that was in my room. It finally hit the bottom of the stairs, and I asked my friend if it was him that did that. I remember thinking, great, the first dang night I'm in here, and something weird has to happen. I definitely would have seen if my friend had thrown the marble down the stairs, but he didn't. By the way, this actually happened one more time before, not happening since. That story can probably be explained easily, but there are other weird ones. In the same room I was sleeping one night, I'm 95% sure I would have closed my closet all the way before I went to bed, because a thing like that would bother the hell out of me, and I wouldn't be able to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to a very strange noise. It was a quick and harsh boom mixed with a whoosh sound. I looked around my room to find the source, and my eyes focused on my closet door. The door was open. I sort of stood up and chuckled because it was 3 a.m. I closed the door and went back to sleep. I later analyzed the sound because I remembered when I woke up. What it sounded like was the closet door being pushed hard from the inside and rubbing on the carpet as it opened, which would account for the whoosh. I was never scared, just sort of curious as to whether or not I was insane. The next experience was definitely an odd one. It was the morning. Morning is like 12 noon to me, especially in the summer. And I had woken up and was getting ready to take a shower. I made my way downstairs and was heading to my mom's room to get a towel. No one else was in the house at this time. My mom was working, and so was her boyfriend. As I was passing through our dining room, I felt something cold hit my right earlobe. Within a couple seconds, my fingers were up to my ear to pinch whatever was on my ear, because I thought it was a bug. I took my fingers away and realized that what hit my ear was a drop of some liquid. It didn't feel like water. It almost felt like oil. It had a strange smell to it, almost like a perfume oil smell. Very confused, I rubbed it in my fingers and looked around the ceiling for the source. But if you think about it, an earlobe is an awkward place for something like that to land on. If it was coming from above, it would have hit the top of my ear, right? But that's not the end. I shrugged it off, got my towel, and went into the bathroom. I took my shirt off, and splot, I felt a drop hit my chest. Now this was weird, because I was totally in a different part of my house. And again, The chest is an odd place if the drop is falling from above. Before touching the spot, I looked at it. It definitely splattered with some force because it was spread out a little. I touched it and smelled it, and it was the same dang substance. Why is this relevant? One night, I awoke to hear a very disturbing noise coming from the bathroom. Nobody was up at the time, and I heard a very distinct gurgling noise. I walked towards the bathroom to see what it was, when the lights turned on by themselves, and the shower curtain was moving. Remember, nobody was up, the lights were off, and they somehow managed to turn themselves on. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to inch closer to the shower curtain. I had to know if something was behind it. I moved the curtain, and to my relief, there was nobody there. But then the lights turn off once again. I start to get really freaked out and rush to turn on the light. I look across the hallway, and I see what looks like an elderly man in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask on his face. He looked about as real as any living person would. Now, it wasn't like I saw this figure for a long time. I wasn't on meds, and I'm a sober person. I wouldn't even say I was tired. The encounter lasted about 10 to 15 seconds. It was fast, but it was long enough that I could see this man. I honestly felt like the liquid that I felt came from this gurgly elderly man. I found that very interesting, and later, I told my mom about it. She thought I was joking and laughed it off, then grew very concerned after I insisted that this was something I saw. She thought I was having hallucinations and wanted to take me to the doctor, but I urged her that I was of sound mind. Although she did later tell me that something similar happened to her, where she could have sworn she felt the presence of an elderly man, but she never saw anything. Lastly, there was an unexplained experience that happened in my room. One of my cats was sleeping on my bed, and I was sitting in this love seat I have, watching TV. My lights were off, so I couldn't see anything clearly other than the TV. Something startled me when I heard something hit my wall, as if being thrown, like a hammer hitting a wall. I then started to notice that my cat uncharacteristically started hissing at the window and moaning. She's usually a very quiet cat, but something really seemed to bother her, and she wouldn't keep quiet. She kept meowing for what seemed like 5 minutes. I didn't see anything in the window, and the cat for the next week persisted to meow in terror before she just gave up. She never did that ever again, and it was quite bizarre. It really started to scare me. On a separate day, I've heard cabinets opening and shutting. These things terrify me because I still have no explanation for them. Is my house haunted by a timid spirit who wants to know that it's there? Any comments or advice would be appreciated. Hope you found my story interesting. During the summer of 1976, my mom, older brother, and I decided to accompany my aunt and her family to West Virginia and North Carolina to work in the tobacco fields. I was about 11 years old at the time. After a 2-day trip from Texas to West Virginia, we were assigned a house to stay in while we were settled into work. There were several of us, 10 in all, and we were tired from the trip, so everyone just basically picked a spot in a place and readied ourselves for bed for that first night. It was not a restful night. At about 3 a.m., we were awakened by the sounds of a woman crying and wailing in the room with us. Looking around the room, we could see that everyone was accounted for and no one was crying. The sounds increased in intensity and lasted for about 10 minutes. When I say wailing, I mean just that. A horrible, low sound. Very similar to some of the sound effects heard in the old Scooby-Doo cartoons. I realize that sounds somewhat funny, but I swear it's true. I'm not sure if my eyes were just playing tricks on me, but in the darkness of the room, it really looked like there was a figure kneeling down. You could see it well enough in the dark to know that it was a gray outline of some figure. Interestingly enough, after the 10 minutes of sobbing, I noticed that this gray cloud ended up disappearing as well. Thankfully, we weren't to stay in that house for very long. Another house, with more room for 10 people, was assigned to us. That was not an improvement. The next house was a 2-story one, located somewhere between Hendersonville, North Carolina, in a small town known as Soul City. It was situated about 200 yards off a road, with a long driveway and a set of railroad tracks that ran along the other side of the road. There was a large white house off to the north of our house, about another 300 yards away. The house had a large open field in front, and was surrounded by woods on the other 3 sides, and a shed, and an old open water well in back. Spooky enough setting during the day. At night, things would happen, such as lights turning on by themselves, footsteps heard upstairs, when everyone was in plain sight downstairs, the sounds of something heavy being all dragged through the house late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, knocking on the walls, and my brother swears he's seen what appeared to be a black hooded figure at the foot of his bed. I remember I had my window open once while asleep at night, and I could have sworn I heard the sounds of a horse running across the field outside. Nobody in our area owns any horses at all, and you could hear the sounds of neighs. I ended up looking outside and saw absolutely nothing, but there was definitely a horse that I heard. I swear to anyone reading this, these events really happened. I know people often make claims like that, which make it seem like it's fabricated, but I really want to put an emphasis on the validity of these stories. All I have is my word, but I'm telling you, these events are so real. I'm 36 now, an Army veteran, college educated, and I have an interest in ghosts and the supernatural. If anyone has any clues about the house, the one near Soul City, North Carolina, its owners, or perhaps even its history, please email me. When I was in 8th grade, my mother, younger brother, and I moved into a rental home on Grace Drive in Wilson, North Carolina. I'd always been interested in ghosts, but never had any experience. This house would change that fact. As soon as we moved into the home, I had a very uneasy feeling, only in my room. I always felt like someone was watching me from my closet. Also, feeling uneasy, I could not sleep with my door closed and forbid my mother to close her door while we were sleeping. I also started sleeping with my pillow on top of my head in order to feel safe and secure in this room. On several occasions, I felt someone pushing the pillow down hard on my head as I was trying to go to sleep. It was not sleep paralysis because I had just laid down. At first I thought it was my brother playing with me, to the point where I yelled out his name for him to stop because the pushing hurt. However, when the pushing stopped, no one was in the room, and I was all alone. One evening around dusk, my mother and I were sitting on the front steps that were located between the bedroom end of the home and the living room, where my brother was alone watching TV. My bedroom was located on the front of the house, with only one window. I had a lamp sitting on my bedstand, in front of the window, and beside the bed. I stood up in order to illustrate a point to my mother now facing the house with my bedroom window in sight. All of a sudden, I saw movement in my window. It was a shadow in the act of sitting on my bed. Once it sat down, the shadow seemed to fade into the shadows of my bedroom. I stood there looking at my window and said to my mother that my brother was in my room and that he needs to get out. I immediately went into the house to find my brother still watching TV. I asked him what he was doing in my room, and he just stared at me like I was crazy, saying that he had not left the living room. Of course, I went to my room to find no one there. We lived in that house for about 2 years, and only when we moved into our new house was I able to sleep with my door closed, with my mother's door closed. However, this new house was where my mother saw her first ghost. This happened about 2 months after we moved into the house. She said that she was laying in bed one night, unable to sleep because the streetlights in the city were so bright. She said that she looked over to her window and saw an old man standing in her room in front of the window. The old man walked over to the bed and looked down at her and then backed away, only to disappear. She smartly did not tell me the story until I'd been away at college for 3 years. We are assuming that the old man was Mr. Barnes, who we think may have died in the house and was just checking in on the new occupants. That was the first and last incident that occurred in that home. I'm 16 years old and live in a small town in Texas. It's about 28 miles south of San Antonio. When I was in 3rd grade, my family decided to move down here from Corpus. We began living with my grandfather and soon decided to buy property of our own. My mom and dad bought the property located right next to my grandfather's, which just happened to be the entrance to a coal mine that was very active about the 1900s. We built our house right next to the entrance to the coal mine. Our back door opened right on top of the entrance. By the time the house was built, I was about 13 and finally had my own room. One night, I was struggling to sleep and heard footsteps. Of course I was frightened, but somehow I went to sleep. I kept telling myself it was nothing. While I was sleeping, and this part of the story doesn't make sense at all, I had a dream that I was part of a well-known Jewish family in Europe in the Great World Conflict. I saw soldiers take my husband and I to a ditch in the middle of nowhere, where they got rid of my husband. In my dream, I understood German. Next, they got rid of me also. As I died in my dream, I woke up in real life. As I awoke, I heard more footsteps marching. They sounded like soldiers, Germans I assumed. They marched through my kitchen and some by my bedroom door, kinda like they were watching me. This is the first thing that happened to me. It didn't make sense, because I thought they would be dead miners or something. About 2 years ago, I became very depressed, as many young people do, and I tried to off myself. My mother came home from work and found me passed out and throwing up in the kitchen sink. They rushed me to the nearest hospital, where they thought I was going to pass away. I saw my mom crying next to me and became relaxed. I was in total peace. I felt completely happy. Suddenly, I felt 2 men walking around me talking. I tried to turn my head to see them, but couldn't. I heard them speaking to each other, and one sounded older than the other. They said, "Look, it's so sad she's so young." And the other one said, "Look at her mother." At this point, they quit talking and continued to walk around us staring. Then, the feeling of peace was gone, and I heard 2 other voices. kept saying, "Who is that?" and it was scaring my mom to death. Right after that, I passed out, and when I woke up, I was in a hospital room. I didn't tell anyone exactly what it was I heard. I did tell my boyfriend of the time. I'm not sure he believed me. After that, I would hear voices at my house, people talking to me, but there was no one there. I heard them almost everywhere I went, but I didn't tell anyone. After a while, I tried talking back, but never got a response. The voices were never really clear. There were many at one time. It just sounded mumbled. I tried not to tell people about my voices because I was afraid they would not talk to me anymore. I felt I had a gift. They have stopped talking now. I haven't heard them for about a year now. I know it all sounds weird, but it's true. I also live next to a graveyard, which is weird, I know. It's where most of the dead miners are buried. I think they try to talk to me sometimes. There is also one last account I had more recently. I was trying to go to sleep one night in the house all by myself. I looked out into the living room and saw a solid black figure running around. He looked as if he were hiding. He ran behind furniture and walls and really just scared the heck out of me. It was the only time I saw him though. It was the last of all my encounters. Hey, Phantoms! If you enjoy compilations, well, you're right at home here with the newest compilation of sorts. Anyway, guys, I don't know why I said that, but please take a moment to like, comment, and share this video. I decided to put a compilation together because, it's the end of the month almost, and I figured why not give you guys something special like a compilation. Trying to get more content out to you as soon as possible, and that's pretty much all I have to say. So hopefully you enjoyed the new static footage that I added. Added a bunch of new background footage for you guys, so hopefully the video went well with everything. So love you guys.